you really going to a workout. You lost a lot of weight.
Yeah, I lost about 70 pounds. Well, no, it's a style of my own. I created this style.
He could take a simple love song and transform it into a breathtaking roller coaster of sound. With a thunderous voice, rapid-fire scatting, and a signature stuttering phrasing that no one else could master, Billy Stewart didn't just sing, he detonated every note. In the 1,960 seconds, there was nobody like him, and there never would be again. From gospel roots in Washington, D.C., to topping the charts with unforgettable hits like I Do Love You and Summertime, Billy seemed destined for superstardom. His voice, raw and explosive, carried the urgency of a preacher and the creativity of a jazz soloist. He was more than a soul singer. He was a phenomenon waiting to be crowned. But just as the world began to embrace his brilliance, tragedy struck. At only 32 years old, on the verge of a new creative chapter, Billy's journey was cut short in a way no one could have predicted. His death was sudden, shocking, and left fans mourning not just a man, but the future of soul music that died with him. So what really happened to this once-in-a-generation talent? Why does his name remain in the shadows, even while his songs still move us today? This is the true story of Billy Stewart, the man whose music soared higher than anyone imagined, yet whose life ended far too soon. Billy Stewart was born William Larry Stewart II on the 24th of March, 1937, in Washington, D.C., a city buzzing with culture but scarred by inequality. His childhood neighborhood wasn't glamorous, it was modest, working class, and often struggling. Yet it pulsed with sound. Gospel floated from church halls, blues echoed on street corners, and jazz spilled out of kitchen radios. For Billy and countless other African-American families in mid-century America, music wasn't just entertainment. It was survival, identity, and power. Billy was one of 6 children, and music ran like a lifeline through the Stewart household. His parents were devout Christians who leaned on the church for strength, guidance, and song. Sunday service wasn't only about scripture, it was about sound. The choir was thunderous, the hymns fervent, and the congregation alive with rhythm. From the age of 9, Billy wasn't just a child in the pews. He was up front, pounding the piano keys and belting gospel hymns with a raw energy that startled congregations. Alongside his brothers, Billy formed the Stewart Gospel Singers, a local group that quickly became a staple of Washington's gospel circuit. They rehearsed endlessly, their harmonies woven tight, their faith propelling them forward. Through persistence, they landed performances on West AIM, one of the rare radio stations at the time that gave airtime to black gospel groups. Their songs carried hope, resistance, and pride to listeners across the city, and soon the Stewart name was well known in D.C.'s gospel community. Even in those early years, there was something that set Billy apart. His voice didn't just carry a melody, it bent it, reshaped it, filled it with urgency and fire. He had an instinct for phrasing that made his performances unpredictable, emotional, undeniable. And while his siblings could harmonize beautifully, Billy always seemed to take the spotlight without even trying. He sang like someone twice his age, channeling the grit of bluesmen and the fervor of preachers. At the same time, Billy was a piano prodigy. He had no formal training, and he couldn't read sheet music. Yet he could play gospel, boogie-woogie, and jazz with equal flair. He didn't need notes on a page, his fingers knew where to go. Music poured out of him as if it had always been there, waiting to be discovered. By his early teens, Billy was already making waves. Neighborhood crowds came to hear him perform with the family group, and word began to spread, "That boy Billy, he's going somewhere." Armstrong High School became a turning point for young Billy Stewart. A historically black institution in Washington, D.C., it carried a proud legacy of nurturing artists, thinkers, and community leaders. For Billy, it offered something beyond textbooks and assignments. It gave him a stage. Choirs, assemblies, and talent shows became his laboratory, places where he could experiment with sound, push his limits, and challenge tradition. Surrounded by peers who loved music as much as he did, Billy thrived. But even among talented classmates, Billy stood apart. Most teenagers mimicked Nat King Cole, Sam Cooke, or Frank Sinatra, chasing the styles already embraced by audiences. Billy, however, refused imitation. He blended the thunder of gospel with the phrasing of jazz, slipped doo-wop harmonies into dramatic, almost operatic performances. His voice wasn't smooth or predictable. It was wild, daring, and impossible to ignore. Teachers, fellow students, and neighborhood friends all recognized it. Billy didn't sound like anyone else, and he didn't want to. By the time he turned 17, Billy was something of a local legend. With the Stewart gospel singers, he had already drawn crowds across the city. Outside school, he slipped into neighborhood clubs, sometimes underage, sometimes against the rules, just to get his voice heard. Washington's nightlife was alive with R&B and blues, and Billy craved the electricity of live audiences. On dimly lit stages, he pounded piano keys, his fingers flying across chords while his booming vocals filled the room. Patrons couldn't forget him. Some thought his style too much, too loud, too dramatic, but others swore they were hearing the beginning of something revolutionary. That reputation traveled fast. "That boy, Billy," neighbors would whisper. "He's got something." And soon, fate placed the right ears in his path. In the mid-1950 seconds, the legendary Chicago bluesman Bo Diddley came to Washington, D.C. for a show. Word reached him about a young, church-trained singer and pianist who didn't sound like anyone else. Curious, Bo agreed to check him out. What he saw left him floored. Here was a teenager, barely old enough to vote, ripping through piano chords like a seasoned pro and singing with the fiery intensity of a man twice his age. Bo Diddley didn't hesitate. He invited Billy to Chicago, the beating heart of rhythm and blues, and introduced him to Leonard Chess, co-founder of Chess Records, the label that had already launched giants like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and Etta James. For Billy, this was no ordinary opportunity. It was the break of a lifetime, a door swinging open to the world of professional music. Before his first record was ever pressed, Billy Stewart had proven something remarkable. He wasn't trying to fit into the music world. He was building his own. When Billy Stewart followed Bo Diddley to Chicago in the mid-1950 seconds, he walked straight into the nerve center of American rhythm and blues. Chicago was alive with sound blues pouring from Southside clubs, jazz drifting through late-night lounges, and the raw electricity of early rock and roll buzzing in every corner. For a teenager from Washington, D.C., it was overwhelming, but Billy didn't arrive timid or starstruck. He came ready to prove himself. Leonard Chess, co-founder of the powerhouse Chess Records, was no easy man to impress. But Billy's audition was unforgettable. Sitting at the piano, he unleashed a performance that was half gospel revival, half jazz improvisation, and all showmanship. His voice ricocheted between booming baritone and fragile falsetto, while his fingers danced across the keys with reckless confidence. Even the hardened executives in the room couldn't ignore him. They might not have known exactly what to do with his sound, but they knew they were staring at something unique. Thanks to Bo Diddley's support, Billy recorded his first track under Chess's subsidiary, Checker Records. The song, Billy's Blues, wasn't polished or radio-friendly. It was gritty, raw, and bursting with attitude. It featured Bo Diddley himself on guitar, pushing Billy's voice into a storm of energy. The track didn't climb the charts, but it made a statement. Billy Stewart had arrived, and he wasn't here to blend in. Still, the road ahead wasn't easy. The late 1950 seconds music scene was crowded and competitive. Doo-wop harmonies dominated street corners, teen idols were the industry's new darlings, and rock and roll was exploding across the country. Billy's sound didn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. He could croon like a balladeer, shout like a bluesman, or scatter syllables like a bebop horn. But producers and DJs alike struggled to categorize him. Hoping to find his place, Billy moved from Chess to OK Records, another respected label in rhythm and blues. There he recorded several singles, each one a showcase of his booming voice and unusual phrasing. Yet none of them broke through nationally. Part of the problem was the industry's insistence on conformity. Producers wanted him to smooth out his delivery, to sound more like the stars who were already charting. But Billy resisted. He didn't want to mimic Nat King Cole or Jackie Wilson. He wanted to be Billy Stewart, unapologetically different. That refusal to compromise frustrated some in the business. DJs complained that his vocal fireworks were too much for radio. Record executives shook their heads, unsure how to package him. But Billy couldn't be tamed. Even when commercial success eluded him, he poured everything into his recordings, leaving behind tracks that bristled with energy, invention, and a stubborn refusal to play it safe. By the dawn of the 1,960 seconds, Billy's career had yet to explode, but his resolve remained unshaken. He had tested the waters of the industry, experienced its doubts and demands, and still held firm to his identity. He wasn't interested in fitting into someone else's mold. Instead, he was waiting for the right moment and the right label to let him unleash the full force of his voice. That moment was coming. Billy Stewart returned to Chess Records in the early 1,960 seconds, and this time the timing felt right. The label had become a home for artists who pushed boundaries, and unlike his previous stops, the producers at Chess didn't try to sand down his rough edges. They encouraged him to be himself, to experiment, to embrace the quirks that made him unforgettable. For Billy, it was liberating. Inside the Chess studios, he began developing a sound unlike anything on the airwaves. He doubled and tripled his own vocal lines, creating thick layers of harmony that no single singer could replicate. He stuttered syllables deliberately, turning what might have been considered a flaw into a dazzling rhythmic effect. He leapt between falsetto and baritone with fearless ease, often in the same phrase. His phrasing was unpredictable, stretching time in one moment, racing ahead the next, and yet it all held together with an undeniable groove. In 1962, Billy released the song that first captured wider attention, Fat Boy. For years he had struggled with weight and body image, often the subject of cruel jokes. But instead of hiding from it, Billy leaned in. He made the nickname his anthem, singing with swagger and defiance. Fat Boy wasn't just autobiographical, it was rebellious. He transformed vulnerability into confidence, flipping an insult into a badge of pride. The song's boldness caught the attention of R&B stations across the East Coast. It didn't crack the top 40, but it marked the arrival of Billy Stewart as a voice that could not be ignored. After Fat Boy, he kept recording. Tracks like Reap What You Sow, Strange Feeling, Count Me Out, and How Nice It Is showcased his growing mastery. Each one revealed a different side of his artistry: fiery preacher, tender balladeer, or playful showman. Yet radio programmers still didn't quite know what to do with him. His sound didn't fit the polished molds of Motown or the raw blues tradition of Chicago. He was caught in between, too unconventional for mainstream, too soulful to be sidelined. What Billy gained instead was a loyal cult following. In Washington, Chicago, and other cities along the East Coast, fans flocked to his shows. They didn't just listen, they experienced him. On stage, Billy was electric. He attacked the piano like a boxer in the ring, sweating through his suits, leaving audiences gasping with every high note and stuttered phrase. His concerts became word-of-mouth sensations, the kind of performances people talked about long after the lights went down. By the mid-1,960 seconds, Billy was ready. Nearly a decade had passed since his first recordings, years of being told he was too much or too different. But he never bent, never compromised his voice to fit radio formulas. He had refined his craft, built a reputation, and now stood on the edge of national recognition. The music world was about to hear Billy Stewart at full power, and nothing would ever sound the same. After years of pushing against industry indifference, Billy Stewart finally found the stage big enough to hold his voice. The year was 1965, and soul music was beginning to dominate radio waves across America. Motown had perfected its smooth, polished sound, while Southern soul delivered grit and gospel fire. Into this landscape stepped Billy Stewart, a man who refused to choose between polish and grit, instead forging his own daring middle ground. The breakthrough came with a love song. I Do Love You was unlike anything else on the charts. Built on a simple piano progression and tender lyrics, the song could have been a straightforward ballad in another singer's hands. But in Billy's, it became a masterclass in vocal innovation. He layered his own voice again and again, doubling and even tripling phrases until the track swelled with texture. He played with time, pausing deliberately, then rushing ahead with flurries of syllables. One moment he crooned in a velvet baritone, the next he soared into falsetto so delicate it seemed ready to break. Every word carried vulnerability and power in equal measure. Audiences were stunned. DJs replayed the song not just because it was catchy, but because it was unforgettable. Listeners had never heard a love song so raw, so full of passion, so unapologetically unusual. On the Billboard charts, I Do Love You soared to number 6 on the R&B list and number 26 on the Hot 100. For the first time, Billy Stewart was a national name. The single's success also convinced Chess Records to give him a full LP, also titled I Do Love You, which combined the hit single with a mix of other tracks that displayed his versatility. But Billy wasn't finished. Later that same year, he released another single that would become his most beloved, Sitting in the Park. Where I Do Love You was bold and sweeping, Sitting in the Park was quiet and aching. The lyrics told a simple story waiting for someone who never arrives, but Billy transformed it into a meditation on longing. He slowed the tempo, stretching phrases until the silence itself felt heavy. His voice cracked just slightly on the verses, a subtle imperfection that made the heartbreak real. And with each return of the refrain, I'm sitting in the park waiting for you, the ache deepened, like a wound that refused to close. Commercially, Sitting in the Park matched the success of its predecessor, reaching number 4 on the R&B chart and number 24 on the Hot 100. But emotionally, it surpassed it. Lovers clung to the song, finding in it the soundtrack to their own heartbreaks. DJs received floods of requests. Couples danced to it slowly in darkened rooms, while lonely fans played it on repeat, letting Billy's voice articulate feelings they couldn't put into words. With 2 back-to-back hits, Billy Stewart was suddenly everywhere. He appeared on popular television shows like American Bandstand and Shindig, exposing his sound to audiences far beyond D.C. and Chicago. On stage, he was even more magnetic. Songs that lasted 3 minutes on record could stretch to 5 or 6 in concert, as he unleashed extended improvisations, scatting like a trumpet, whispering like a jazz singer, or screaming like a preacher. No 2 performances were alike, and fans left shows buzzing that they had witnessed something singular. In an era when Motown stars moved with choreographed precision and polished harmonies, Billy was the opposite: wild, unpredictable, and uncontainable. Yet that unpredictability was exactly what made him unforgettable. By the end of 1965, he had not only proven that his unorthodox style could conquer the charts, but also positioned himself as one of soul's most compelling new voices. Billy Stewart had finally broken through, and now, with momentum on his side, he was ready to take an even bigger risk, one that would cement his reputation as a fearless innovator. By 1966, Billy Stewart was no longer a hidden gem. With I Do Love You and Sitting in the Park filling jukeboxes and radio playlists across the country, he had earned a loyal fan base and the respect of critics who admired his audacity. But Billy himself wasn't satisfied. He didn't want to be known only for tender love songs. He wanted to show the world that his voice wasn't just powerful, it was limitless. To prove it, he chose a song almost sacred in American music, Summertime. Written by George Gershwin in 1934 for the opera Porgy and Bess, Summertime had been covered by countless legends: Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, even Janis Joplin. For many, it was untouchable, a piece so iconic that any new version risked sacrilege. Yet that challenge was exactly what drew Billy in. He wasn't interested in safe choices. He wanted to stretch the boundaries of what soul music could be. Recorded with Chess's studio band and released in 1966, Billy's Summertime began innocently enough. A gentle piano, soft strings, a mood of quiet expectation, and then came the explosion. Billy burst into the lyrics with his signature stuttering phrasing, repeating syllables 5 and 6 times with razor-sharp rhythmic control. Su-su-su, summertime, and the living is easy. Instead of the lullaby audiences expected, Billy delivered a roller coaster of vocal pyrotechnics. His voice leapt octaves, ricocheted across rhythms, and broke into scat runs so fast they sounded like a bebop trumpet. He held notes until they threatened to shatter, then snapped into screams that shook listeners awake. It was chaotic, brilliant, and utterly new. No soul singer had ever attempted anything like it. At first, radio DJs didn't know what to make of it. Was it soul? Was it jazz? Was it some kind of experimental fusion? But once the song hit the airwaves, there was no denying its power. Audiences were captivated. Summertime shot to number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 10 on the R&B chart, becoming the most commercially successful version of the song ever recorded. Critics scrambled for words. Some called it a tour de force. Others described it as insanity turned to genius. Jazz purists were divided, some horrified at how far Billy had bent the melody, others in awe of his fearless innovation. Even Gershwin's estate reportedly approved, acknowledging that if Summertime had to be reinvented, Stewart's version was the boldest in decades. The real magic, though, came in performance. On television shows like American Bandstand and Shindig, Billy electrified audiences who had never seen a soul singer tackle an opera standard with such swagger. In clubs, Summertime became his showstopper. He would hold a note for 8 seconds, then break it with a scream. He'd tease the audience with slow builds and sudden tempo shifts. No two performances were the same, but all left crowds stunned and shouting. Over the years, the song's influence only grew. It resurfaced in films and documentaries, most memorably in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in 2019, reintroducing Billy's brilliance to a new generation. Musicians across genres, soul, hip-hop, rock, and jazz, have cited it as an inspiration. In 2021, a PBS documentary titled Fat Boy, the Billy Stewart story highlighted Summertime as the crowning jewel of his artistry. For Billy, Summertime was more than a hit. It was a manifesto. It proved that soul singers could push boundaries as boldly as jazz improvisers, that vocal quirks could be weapons of artistry, and that mainstream audiences were ready, even eager, for something this unconventional. By the end of 1966, Billy Stewart had done the impossible. He had taken one of the most sacred songs in American music and made it his own, leaving a version so daring and unforgettable that it still stands as one of the greatest interpretations in history. Billy was no longer just a rising star. He was a phenomenon, a man who had rewritten the rules of soul music with nothing more than his voice. By the late 1960s, Billy Stewart had established himself as one of the most distinctive voices in soul. He had hits on the charts, electrifying performances on television, and a reputation as a fearless innovator. Yet even as his star rose, he faced challenges that threatened to pull him down. For every cheer from the crowd, there was pressure from the industry. For every standing ovation, there were battles with his own health. Behind the booming voice and radiant stage presence, Billy was fighting on multiple fronts. One of his constant struggles was the way the music business tried to define him. Record executives and radio programmers preferred artists they could fit neatly into categories. Motown singers were polished and predictable. Southern soul artists carried raw gospel energy. Blues musicians had their own established formulas. Billy, however, belonged to none of those boxes. He was too unconventional, too experimental, too unwilling to smooth his edges. This uniqueness had given him his greatest triumphs, but it also made him a headache for those who tried to market him. Producers often urged him to tone down his delivery, to stop repeating syllables or stretching phrases into uncharted rhythms. DJs complained that his stuttering runs were too much for radio play. But Billy refused to compromise. He believed his quirks weren't flaws but gifts. To change them would be to betray the very essence of his music. That refusal came at a cost. While his peers enjoyed constant airplay and crossover opportunities, Billy remained an outlier celebrated by devoted fans, but often misunderstood by the mainstream. Then there was his health. Billy had struggled with weight since childhood, and by his late 20s he weighed more than 300 pounds. His size was sometimes a punchline, sometimes a point of pride. He leaned into it with songs like Fat Boy, turning vulnerability into swagger. Yet behind the humor was a more serious reality. He suffered from diabetes, and doctors warned him about the risks of heart trouble, exhaustion, and complications. The touring lifestyle only made things worse. Fast food on the road, long nights, and relentless pressure. Still, Billy refused to let his health slow him down. On stage, he gave everything he had, often sweating through his suits but never holding back. Audiences marveled at the way he poured out energy, no matter how exhausted he might have been behind the scenes. Friends recalled that he performed at 110% every night, as though he knew that every show might be someone's first, and he wanted to leave them stunned. Yet perhaps the strongest anchor in Billy's life was his family and faith. Unlike many stars of his generation, he never abandoned Washington, D.C. Even as opportunities pulled others toward New York or Los Angeles, Billy stayed rooted in his hometown. He was a devoted husband and father who brought his children to rehearsals and sound checks, determined to remain present despite the demands of fame. At home, he made sure birthdays, holidays, and school events were never sacrificed to the road. His commitment to community was just as strong. Billy donated generously to churches and youth programs. He paid for instruments for young musicians and often performed free shows for schools and community centers. During the holidays, he delivered food and gifts to struggling families quietly, without seeking recognition. For Billy, giving wasn't a performance. It was who he was. Through it all, his faith remained central. He still performed gospel music, still returned to church choirs, still spoke about music as a gift from God. Friends remembered him quoting scripture backstage, or sitting down at a piano after a high-energy nightclub gig to play hymns late into the night. It was his way of staying grounded, a spiritual reset amid the chaos of the music business. This balance between dazzling success and personal struggle, between industry battles and community devotion, defined Billy Stewart in the years after his breakthrough. He was a man pulled in different directions, yet determined to remain true to himself. But while he managed to juggle these pressures for a time, destiny had other plans. His greatest conflict, the one that would end his story far too soon, was just around the corner. By the end of 1969, Billy Stewart was riding a new wave of creativity. Far from fading, he was expanding. He had been in talks with Chess Records about a fresh project that would lean even further into jazz fusion while still rooted in the gospel fire that had shaped him. There was even discussion of a children's music album, inspired by his own kids, a side of Billy most fans never got to see. At only 32, he seemed poised for a second act that could have taken his artistry to new heights. Then came the 17th of January, 1970. The morning was cold and damp in the Carolinas as Billy and 3 members of his band set out from Washington, D.C., bound for Columbia, South Carolina. They were scheduled to perform at the Township Auditorium, another night of dazzling music for crowds eager to hear that thunderous voice. The group traveled in Billy's 1969 Ford Thunderbird, with Billy himself behind the wheel. He often preferred to drive it, gave him a sense of freedom, camaraderie with his bandmates, and the simple joy of being on the open road. Alongside him were drummer Norman P. Rich, guitarist Rico Hightower, and bassist William Cathay. The 4 men shared jokes, stories, and the anticipation of another performance. But just outside Smithfield, North Carolina, everything went terribly wrong. According to Highway Patrol reports, Billy's Thunderbird veered off U.S. Route 301 at high speed. Some witnesses believed the slick conditions contributed. Others speculated about mechanical failure, perhaps a problem with the cruise control. Whatever the cause, the car broke through a guardrail and plunged into the Neuse River. Within seconds, the vehicle was submerged. Rescue teams arrived quickly and pulled all 4 men from the water, but it was too late. Billy Stewart and his 3 bandmates were pronounced dead at the scene. The news spread like wildfire. That evening, radio stations in Washington and Chicago interrupted their programming. Soul singer Billy Stewart dead in auto accident. Within hours, the Associated Press carried the headline nationwide. Fans were stunned. DJs cried on the air as they replayed "I Do Love You" and "Sitting in the Park." Musicians who had shared stages with Billy just weeks earlier were left speechless. Bo Diddley, the man who had discovered him as a teenager, was especially shaken, devastated that the talent he had once brought to Chess Records was gone in an instant. For Billy's wife and children, the loss was unimaginable. One moment he was at home joking over breakfast, the next he was gone, swallowed by a river on a gray January morning. His mother, Ida May, who had taught him to sing gospel hymns as a boy, now faced the unbearable task of burying her son. The Stewart home in Southeast D.C. became a gathering place for neighbors, musicians, ministers, and grieving fans. The community that had nurtured Billy in his youth now came together to mourn him. His funeral was held at Israel Metropolitan CME Church in Washington, not far from where his journey had begun. More than 1,000 mourners crowded inside: music executives, gospel choirs, neighborhood children in school uniforms, church leaders, and fans who had danced and wept to his songs. As the choir sang, "His eye is on the sparrow," there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. Billy Stewart was laid to rest at Lincoln Memorial Cemetery in Suitland, Maryland. under a modest grave that belied the size of his voice. The exact cause of the accident was never definitively established. Some insisted the Thunderbird's cruise control had malfunctioned. Others pointed to fatigue or the slick conditions of the road. In the end, the technical explanation mattered less than the devastating reality. Soul music had lost one of its most original voices, a man who was not only still relevant but still rising. Billy Stewart's death wasn't just tragic, it was gutting. He hadn't burned out or faded away. He was still dreaming, still innovating, still plotting the next chapter of his career. And then, in one cruel moment, it was over. In the days and months after Billy Stewart's untimely death, his music became both a memorial and a lifeline. Fans who had once danced to his joyous rhythm and a lifeline. Fans who had once danced to his joyous rhythm and a lifeline. Fans who had once danced to his joyous rhythms now played his records through tears, clinging to the sound of a voice that felt larger than life. And as the decades rolled on, it became clear that his songs were not just products of the 1,960 seconds, they were timeless. I Do Love You remained one of the most enduring love songs of its era. The layered harmonies, the aching falsetto, the stuttered phrasing, it all combined into a track that still hits with immediacy. Radio stations across the country continued to spin it long after the charts had moved on, and it became a staple of quiet storm playlists that dominated R&B radio in later years. Couples danced to it at weddings, lovers whispered its lyrics to each other, and new generations discovered its tender power. Then there was Sitting in the Park. If I Do Love You was the sound of romance, Sitting in the Park was the sound of heartbreak. Its restrained tempo, its haunting refrain, and the subtle cracks in Billy's voice gave it a melancholy that never grew old. Listeners returned to it during moments of loss and longing, finding solace in its simplicity. Even decades later, the song still feels fresh, an aching reminder of love unfulfilled. And of course, there was Summertime. Billy's radical reinterpretation didn't fade with the era. Instead, it grew in stature, referenced again and again in films, television shows, and retrospectives. Every time his explosive phrasing echoed in a new context, it reminded audiences that this was not just another cover, it was an act of reinvention, a daring artistic statement that stood the test of time. When Quentin Tarantino used it in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in 2019, a whole new generation of listeners scrambled to find out who had delivered such a jaw-dropping performance more than 50 years earlier. Billy's recordings became more than nostalgia. They became shorthand for raw emotion, joy, heartbreak, innovation, audacity. Radio DJs leaned on them whenever they needed to evoke a mood. Filmmakers and advertisers licensed them for the same reason. Few sounds could transport an audience as instantly as Billy Stewart's trembling, passionate voice. Meanwhile, vinyl collectors began to treat his original records as treasures. Pressings of his chess singles and LPs were traded, coveted, and cherished. For many, owning a Billy Stewart record was like holding a piece of musical history that mainstream audiences had overlooked but insiders understood was gold. Perhaps the most remarkable part of Billy's legacy was that his music never felt dated. Unlike some recordings that sound frozen in their era, his songs carried a vitality that still speaks directly to the human heart. Whether it was the defiant swagger of Fat Boy, the aching vulnerability of Sitting in the Park, or the controlled chaos of Summertime, Billy's catalog proved that true innovation never ages. In short, the music lived on, undiminished. Though his career was cut brutally short, the sound of Billy Stewart refused to die. Every time his record spun, his voice rose again, unmistakable, unstoppable, unforgettable. Billy Stewart may not have lived to see his full impact, but his voice echoed through generations of artists who followed him. They didn't just admire his hits, they studied his fearlessness, his willingness to take risks, and his ability to turn quirks into trademark. Al Green, one of soul's smoothest voices, blended gospel intensity with delicate falsetto in ways that bore clear traces of Billy's phrasing. Erykah Badu, decades later, incorporated vocal ornamentation and improvisational phrasing into her neo-soul aesthetic techniques that had once shocked DJs when Billy first used them. D'Angelo, with his fluid runs and rhythmic daring, carried Billy's spirit into the modern R&B era. Even Prince, known for his outrageous vocal range and theatrical experimentation, reportedly admired Stewart's fearless approach to bending music until it became something new. Contemporary tributes also surfaced. R&B singer Tank recorded a heartfelt version of I Do Love You as a nod to Stewart's enduring influence, reintroducing the classic to modern audiences. Hip-hop producers sampled his voice, weaving fragments of his songs into beats, proving that Billy's stuttering delivery and layered harmonies had rhythms powerful enough to live on in entirely new genres. Yet despite this far-reaching influence, Billy Stewart's name never achieved the household recognition of Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, or Marvin Gaye. Scholars of Black American music often note this imbalance, pointing out that Stewart's innovations were every bit as bold as those of his peers, but his life was cut too short for the industry to fully embrace him. In academic circles, however, his legacy has grown steadily. Professors and historians now place him in conversations alongside the greatest voices of soul, describing him as a best-kept secret in American music. Recognition came in other forms as well. The Washington Area Music Association inducted Billy into its Hall of Fame, celebrating him as one of D.C.'s most important musical sons. The Smithsonian included tributes to him during concerts honoring the city's cultural heritage. In his own community, locals unofficially renamed a stretch of road Billy Stewart Way, ensuring that his name remained tied to the neighborhoods that shaped him. At Lincoln Memorial Cemetery in Suitland, Maryland, fans from around the world visit the bronze plaque that marks his grave, leaving flowers, notes, and records as offerings. On digital platforms, his legacy has grown stronger with each passing year. YouTube videos of his performances rack up millions of views, shocking new listeners with the sheer audacity of his sound. In online forums, collectors swap stories about rare Billy Stewart vinyl, treating his records like precious artifacts. For fans who stumble across his music for the first time, the reaction is nearly universal. Why haven't I heard this before? That question underscores the paradox of Billy Stewart's legacy. He was both hidden and everywhere, his songs instantly recognizable, his name too often forgotten. For those who know, he is a giant. For those who don't, discovery feels like unearthing a treasure. And that duality, perhaps, is the ultimate proof of his underrated greatness. Billy Stewart didn't leave behind decades of albums, world tours, or Grammy trophies. But what he did leave behind was something rarer, a body of work that feels alive, urgent, and inspiring more than half a century later. His recognition may have come slowly, unevenly, and sometimes only in retrospect, but it came nonetheless. And with every new listener who presses play, his voice continues to earn the respect it always deserved. Billy Stewart's life was brief, but his voice was eternal. From the pews of Washington, D.C. churches to the studios of Chess Records, from local radio to national television, he never stopped pushing against limits. He could turn a ballad into an anthem, a standard into an explosion, a moment into a memory. He didn't just sing, he reinvented what singing could be. And yet, his story remains one of soul music's great injustices. While the names of Sam Cooke, Marvin Gaye, and Otis Redding are etched into history books, Billy Stewart's name too often lingers in the margins. Why? Was it because his style was too unconventional, too uncontainable for the mainstream to embrace? Was it simply the cruel timing of his death at 32, just as he was preparing for a new chapter? Or was it that the industry, always hungry for easy categories, never knew how to package a man who defied every label? What we do know is this: Billy Stewart was one of a kind. He lived with faith, loved his family, gave to his community, and poured his entire being into every note he sang. His songs I Do Love You, Sitting in the Park, and his legendary Summertime remain as fresh and startling today as the day they were recorded. They are proof that true originality never fades. So perhaps the question isn't whether Billy Stewart deserved more recognition he did. The question is whether we, as listeners, are ready to reclaim his place in the pantheon of soul. Shouldn't his name sit beside Cooke, Wilson, and Gaye? Shouldn't his daring artistry be celebrated not as a footnote, but as a chapter in the story of American music? Billy Stewart may have been silenced by a river in North Carolina, but his voice still rises. Every time you hear that stuttered phrase, that soaring falsetto, that explosive joy, you're reminded of a man who refused to play it safe, a man who gave everything and left too soon. His career ended